Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21 and the local group Enfield Voices. And today we're interviewing Nick De Bois, who used to be an MP in North Enfield. And since then, he's been doing lots of things, including recently writing a novel. And that's what we're going to talk to him about today. So, Nick, if I could begin, I mean, you actually did write a novel, but you've already written a memoir as well, in Confessions of an MP. What were you trying to confess?
Well, actually, in Confessions of a Recovering MP, I never thought of it as a memoir, but it has been described like that. And essentially, I've tried to make it entertaining, using lots of anecdotes to kind of illustrate the point about what MPs do, what they come across, and what they're faced with, both in their sort of local constituency and, of course, in Parliament and when dealing with government. And I guess all I would say to anyone reading it is don't worry whether it's Labour, Conservative, Liberal, or whatever, because it's not a political book. But I can guarantee whatever you thought of MPs before you read it, you will change your mind once you have read it. Now, I'm not saying you'll necessarily think kindly of MPs, but you will have a greater understanding of some of the challenges and risks and opportunities that they face.
So is that why you wrote a novel as well? I mean, were you trying to get them to, look at Parliament and MPs in a different way?
Absolutely not. No, I mean, if you want to believe the very worst of politicians, this is the book to read. But in a way, again, it's not really a political novel. It uses the backdrop of Westminster and this basically very sort of controversial idea that a government rocked by huge problems in the economy and post-Brexit, the post-pandemic, actually start to take steps to rejoin, or shall we say, have ever closer union with Europe, which of course is the political backdrop for chaos, a leadership election, murder, betrayal, all the sorts of things you'd expect to find in a thriller.
But, some people might say, okay, it is about that. Remainers might not like it. They might say, this is Nick getting at the EU once again.
Oh, you don't know, do they? They'd have to read to see the outcome, you see. It would be a very odd proposition, really, for a Remainer to object, although I'd like to ditch that term now, but anyone who is sort of still regretful about the vote, it'd be a very odd proposition not to welcome the idea that a government might try and rejoin and get ever closer union with the EU.
Yeah, but I don't agree with those people who looked at it that way. For example, Chris Mullin wrote a book, A Very British Coup, and it was about a left-wing prime minister with 100 majority. And he gets thrown out by a coup, by dark forces. Now, right-wing people in the Labour Party might hate it, but like your book, you should forget about the politics, or at least the essential, the visible politics, and look for the things underneath, because you're both getting at similar things, aren't you?
It's quite interesting. It's about who's really pulling the strings at the end of the day. So you've got this very ambitious, stereotypical Tory cabinet minister, James Cleaver, who believes he's the rightful heir to lead the country after they've sort of dumped the current prime minister. And by the way, I deal with Boris Johnson in the early pages. He's gone, and he's gone in 2023, if anyone's interested in that. And we kind of kick off from there. There's a successor who has loads of difficulties, and along comes this leadership contest, and on it goes from there. But the heroine, of course, is Beth Anderson, who's this journalist who's ruthlessly investigating things, but even she's challenged with her principles, because what's at the heart of all of this is what will you do in the name of ambition? And that's ambition of the journalists, the politicians, the special advisors, and some people meet an untimely end, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, Beth began as a very principled person, leaving a big company, going to a small blog, and in the end, sort of succumbing to her own career ambitions. But you left it in such a way that she could redeem herself if you do a sequel. Are you planning to do that?
It's open, it's crying out for a sequel. I absolutely agree with you. And perhaps the biggest compliment I had made was a review I got from someone who's, I think they're about to post it actually. And they said, it really is a page turner. I was enjoying turning the pages of the book. As I was getting to the end, I slowed down reading it because I didn't want it to end. And then lo and behold, it's blindingly obvious you've got to do another book on this same subject because there is a follow-up in it.
Yeah, I think you need to do another book because I think it has, you know, a lot of stories to tell. I mean, you mentioned Beth, and she's very interesting. And at one point she says, whatever you think about democracy, one thing is clear, and that's politicians are not answerable to the voters. Elections swap the main players around to make the public feel like they're in charge. Is that something that you feel from your experience in politics and when you wrote that book?
It's a really, really good question. And I think, although it fitted with the theme, that our voters just really a sort of bit player in the whole way that we govern our country, that did fit the theme of the book. I must say that every time, for example, you look closely at politics, there are decisions being taken in our name that really we haven't, for example, consulted on. Now, I don't mean micromanagement of every single decision. Goodness, that would be a nightmare. But when you change the leader of a party mid-term, you know, that is an extraordinary thing if you think about it, because the public know that they're voting for a prime minister, even though our system, when you go and cast your vote locally, isn't doing that. We know who the leader of the party will be. We know who prime minister is. And then, you know, along you come 2 years later and you change leader without the consent of the people. That is kind of what that's referring to. Remember, this goes back for decades. I mean, it's been going on for years. Ken Livingstone took power. Those who remember Ken Livingstone in the GLC before it got abolished by Margaret Thatcher. He did a coup weeks after they just elected the Labour Party with a moderate leader. So it's not new.
If only you could have been around when Harold Macmillan gave up being a premiership in the middle of the Tory party conference. You could have written a fantastic novel on that.
Absolutely, yes.
I mean, do you think when you know you write novels as an MP, you can't be really a political hack? Not you, not Chris Mullin, not Tom Watson, not anyone. What you have to be is what John Biffen was once called semi-detached.
I think you have to be semi-detached if you want to write anything that is not just going to be politically prejudiced and have no interest to anyone. And you might as well put it on the library that says politics. This book is definitely not. And I think you've got to have that self-awareness to be prepared to criticize, challenge, and see weaknesses in a system that, don't forget, I love our democracy. I think it's still one of the best in the world for all its flaws. But you know, if you're going to write a novel, which is a story, you've got to be open-minded about it and have that, as you say, semi-detached perspective. And I wish more MPs did have a semi-detached perspective, because frankly, I think more self-awareness is probably not a bad thing.
Yeah, I guess you have to be an insider on the outside, and that's a really important place to be. I mean, do you think MPs write novels like yourself, or ex-MPs write novels like Tom Watson, Chris Mullin, and so on, because they can say in novels things that they can't quite say openly outside? It gives them the fiction to be able to tell the truth.
Well, you're probably talking to the wrong man here, because I was a bit of a rebel when I was in Parliament, and if I disagree with my government, I would happily say so. In many ways, I will always be writing in defence of what I think is one of the best democratic systems in the world, which I know will irritate a lot of people, but if you stop and think about it and look around, we do rather well. So maybe underneath all of this, there is my deep love and affection of the place, which is why I can't quite let go, which is why I wrote perhaps Confessions of a Recovering MP, and now a story, Fatal Ambition. But remember, I've seen ambition close up. So I worked during the leadership campaign of the 2007, the post Theresa May 2019 leadership election. I was right in there for one of the campaign teams, and I touch on some of the rather questionable practices that go on. They're hinted at in the book.
Yeah, I mean, it's only a rebel that could have given Boris Johnson a stroke at the beginning of his book. So you,
A small stroke.
a small stroke, but enough to get him out of the way. I mean, one of your characters in the book says that they never fought an election and didn't know the unpredictable nature of electorates, least of all the fickle, self-serving colleagues in his own party whose votes could be bought or sold quite cheaply in Conservative Party elections. Is that something you experienced?
It's really interesting. I think I've always been shaped by the fact that I was in a marginal seat in politics, and you are held to a higher standard by the electorate than if you are in what I would call a safe seat. And I think that can breed, doesn't always breed, a little bit of contempt for perhaps contempt is a hard word, a complacency, perhaps, that is not a healthy side of our democracy. Have I been superly political in the way I've answered that?
No. You're allowed to be, because you're an outside politician, which is a good thing to be. I mean, the two of the main themes in your novel, in a way, is money and ambition. And Beth says at one point that she really needs to follow Woodward and Bernstein, who always said, follow the money, and then you find out what's happening. Do you have the impression, and were you trying to get over that money, Owen Paterson, money could be a dark force in politics?
No, I wasn't. And I wouldn't relate it to the current things that have been going on in Parliament in the last 24 hours, which I do have a view on, and we could spend hours talking about that. No, what I was trying to do is, I'm a huge fan of the Watergate scandal. I've read so much about Watergate. For those that don't know, this was the break-in in a complex called Watergate that led ultimately to the resignation of an American president, Richard Nixon, through brilliant investigative journalism. Beth wants to be, her heroes are, and she has an American mother, of course, her heroes are Bernstein and Woodward. And all they were told during the investigation was follow the money. And that's what they did. And that's how they effectively uncovered the corruption that was going on in the name of the then president. It was obvious that I had to have corrupt money in this, but this was corrupt money that was sort of, I don't want to give too much away, but was effectively used to buy out a certain minister from huge personal problems that he had. And it was by following the money that they effectively started to unravel this trail. And of course, that was attempted to be covered up, which leads to murder, intrigue, betrayal, and so forth.
And of course, the chief sort of professional person in the Prime Minister's office was bought off as well. And that was quite interesting. I mean, you wrote a novel where all the corruption sort of went right into the center of politics, right into the center where the power was.
Very interesting, because I was chief of staff, of course, to Dominic Raab when he was Brexit secretary. And you're talking about Karen, who is the chief of staff to the Prime Minister. And what's quite interesting, and you've alluded to it, but the corruption isn't actually with the politician in that case. The corruption in her case is far less about money, but it's a corruption of power at the heart of number 10. She gets involved in things that, frankly, she just shouldn't have been doing. They were anti-democratic, etc. But she's bought into a corruption. And of course, that ultimately that reflects on who's governing us. So, I mean, it's beginning to sound like a big theological treatise, this. It's actually quite an entertaining novel. But Karen's corruption, again, is so insidious. You actually eventually have to think, oh my God, she shouldn't be doing this. And at one point you're kind of rooting for her, and then you think, oh my God, this is wrong. She shouldn't be doing this.
She is a very powerful woman in your novel. And of course, I mean, the other theme is what you call the novel, ambition, fatal ambition, not fatal attraction, fatal ambition. And, there's one point, I think, where you say in the novel, it's politicians who see it all the time. They stab each other in the back as a matter of course, so they can climb the ladder to high office. Is that Nick De Bois crying a cry of despair?
It was Nick De Bois saying that there are people who go into Parliament and are ruthlessly ambitious from day one. They will trade whatever they can to climb the ladder of success. In many ways, ambition is not a bad thing. Don't get me wrong. If you go into Parliament and you want to be a minister, you want to be a cabinet minister, you even want to be prime minister, that is no bad thing. After all, you don't really necessarily want someone who's not really interested in the job to do it. But sometimes the routes to that, I think, are highly questionable. And we've seen those sorts of practices in leadership elections, unsavory leaks that have suddenly emerged that people have been sitting on. We've seen all of that in the last leadership election contest and before. Do people play games on their way up? Well, I can tell you the jockeying amongst cabinet ministers in the leading up to the inevitable downfall of Theresa May. They were writing notes to each other in cabinet expressing views on her leadership and so forth. So trust me, these are human beings. If they have ambition, that ambition will materialize on the whole and in the main in a respectable fashion. But this is a novel and a story, isn't it? So obviously, if you want to think the worst about politicians, you will love this book.
There is a big bang on the desk to prove it. And there's been a book written about the sort of Theresa May fiasco, hasn't there, which is really, really interesting as well. But you alluded earlier too that, this isn't just about ambition of politicians, it's ambition of journalists as well. And the relationship between politician and journalist is really, really interesting, And Beth is a person who you're not quite sure whether she's strong or she's weak or what at the moment. And of course, your sequel might tell us, but at the moment, you read the book and you sort of wonder a bit about her, don't you?
You do, because right at the beginning, she is doing the sort of journalism she doesn't want to do. And this is where I think journalists have really, undermined their profession, a lot of them. It's what we would call clickbait journalism, where you deliberately try and interview someone to trap them into something. So that you can get your clickbait, which is that 30-second clip, which everyone then watches. It goes viral and it can destroy careers. And that isn't the journalism she wants to do. She's brought up on Bernstein and Woodward. She wants to be an investigative journalist. She wants to do serious journalism, and she's in the wrong place. So in a way, she's sold out from day one because she wants the job and she wants the money. And obviously all of that comes under scrutiny. As you point out, she gets compromised herself. As she perhaps, shall we say, lets her ambition get ahead of her. How she comes out of it at the end, I can't really discuss because that would be giving away where we end up. But she, whilst I don't think there's obvious soul searching, you don't get pages and pages of moral dilemmas here. My agent, Kate Nash Literary Agency, they were very clear. They wanted a page turner here, and they were ruthlessly cutting out stuff to make sure that happened. But you will make a judgment on the behavior and standards of everyone involved, including the journalists. And don't forget the compromising power ambition of the special advisor, a job I also held when I was chief of staff to Dominic Raab. Normally, these are youngsters who want to sort of earn their spurs and go on to be an MP, having no experience of life. Okay, well, one of them really sells out at a personal level in the name of ambition. And I could point to hundreds of people like that over the last 10 years in Parliament who've done that.
Yeah, I'm sure you could. But are there any other themes that you're trying to get out in that book that I haven't mentioned yet?
Well, I think in many ways, the key I would draw to in this story is that if you've written something in a story like the big background idea, which is a Conservative government in deep trouble, not winning trade deals. I even spelt out that one of the biggest disappointments, and this is just in the sort of a one-page part of it, the biggest disappointment was not getting a trade deal in America. Now, I wrote that 18 months ago, so that's happened already. And then I've sort of said, and Boris Johnson, who was suffering with the post-economic crisis of the pandemic, huge problems and unfulfilled promises of Brexit, which some would say I don't aspire to, but I have accepted it in the novel, haven't come about. That led to an early election just because he wanted to keep in power, even if it was meant to be a cost. Actually, is it such an unreasonable idea that a government soon might be tempted to get closer European Union, maybe by joining first of all, the EFTA agreement, and then what's called the European Economic Association. The mind boggles. And I'm a little surprised that 18 months ago when I wrote this, I've already ticked off a few things in the first 2 or 3 chapters.
I guess if we had stayed in the European Union, you could have written a novel about the conspiracy to get us back, to get us out. Either way, it could go that way. Tell me, I mean, people who write novels, MPs who write novels, have style. And I just wonder what your style is. I mean, Chris Mullin has a bit of the P.G. Wodehouse about him. It's quite interesting in that sense. And Ross Clarke, who's written a book on climate change, The Denier, uses heavy satire. What would you say your style was?
Oh, I'm unashamed entertainment, commercial literature. If you want a good read, that what I would call, let's call it an airport holiday Christmas stocking novel. It's that sort of thing. I don't want to point to someone else's style, because I think that would immediately sort of define the book and it would be inaccurate. It is a Nick De Bois style in that sense, and people can make a judgment of it. But if you were to hold this book up against other books, I would say, look, it's not John le Carré, right? Which is definitely not. But equally, it's not Jeffrey Archer, which I think sometimes, whilst it's very entertaining and he's sold millions, far more millions than I will, I kind of think that that's lots of little stories wrapped up in one. So I'm going to kind of be a bit reluctant to answer that question directly, which is my prerogative as a former professional MP.
Okay, so your style is unique. I mean, you've talked about you love British democracy. You think it's one of the best, but you show so many deficiencies. How can you hold these contradictory positions on this? I mean, do you think we really do need to do something to reform it? It may be good, but it's not good enough.
Well, I think we should always be prepared to reform and challenge. I mean, don't forget, mine's a novel, but when for example, the shenanigans that go on in the leadership election are all perfectly feasible. And I can tell you some of them have gone on, but I exclude murder, obviously, because that didn't happen. No, to answer your question, I can't, no one has yet convinced me that there is a better system. And that's when I look at other democracies. We may not like sometimes, and we get a bit snobbish about the theatre of the House of Commons, but actually the way that our MPs can hold ministers to account on such a regular basis, you don't see that in many so-called democracies around the world. You certainly don't see it in America with Joe Biden. He doesn't even take questions from journalists half the time, let alone answer to the legislator like we have in our system. So there are compromises, Francis. There are weaknesses. And we're seeing quite a lot exposed, as you and I are talking at the moment. But fundamentally, this system has survived for centuries for a reason, because it's one of the best in the world.
Well, I always love politicians who are very critical of our democracy and then end up saying that it's one of the best in the world. I mean, there are lots of things we could talk about on that, and we won't because we don't have time. But let me ask you, I mean, are you happy with your life now, or do you plan to go back into Westminster again?
No, I wouldn't go back into the House of Commons for the very simple reason. I think there was, for me, I went in quite late in life. There was life before Parliament, which I think is prerequisite. I wish more MPs had more life before they went into Parliament. But there is life after Parliament, and I've really enjoyed it. But I'm also able to achieve things outside of Parliament. So I use the radio show I'm on to push certain causes. Knife crime, I will be talking about people on knife crime as much as I can. I will push causes about even parliamentary weaknesses. I enjoy that. So no, I'm in a very happy place actually, and I'm also enjoying my role as chair of Visit England, which is helping tourism through what's been an extraordinarily difficult time.
So you believe in what Dennis Healey said, every politician should have a hinterland. People like Margaret Thatcher didn't, and that sort of left her in a very depressed state. You must have a hinterland.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully put. I'd forgotten that was Dennis Healey who made that point, and it's one I subscribe to entirely.
Okay, well, I know you've got to go now in a couple of minutes, so just end up by really being outrageously promotional and telling us, you know, if people wanted to read your book, find out more about what you said, where do they go?
Well, the really, really good news is that you can order it from bookshops. Obviously, I doubt many of them keep that many in stock, but you can do that, of course. You can go to my website, ndbbooks.com, and order it many ways, including signed copies, or obviously the usual Amazon, Kindle. It's all out there, Apple iBooks, and so forth. More importantly, though, please do let me know what you think. My social media at Nick De Bois on Twitter. I think I'm on Instagram. I can't remember the name. It's Nick De Bois 2021, or more importantly, Facebook. Always happy to have questions. And if you have book groups or you want sort of after dinner speaking and entertaining, I'll come along, sign a few books, and love talking about politics and broadcasting, which is, of course, my other love at the moment.
Okay, well, that's certainly an offer, and I'm sure people will take that up. Well, thank you for spending the time talking about it. I think it's a great book, and I think it is a page turner. I mean, I love ex-MPs who write books because they bring an insight into their book that other people don't normally have, and they weave it into the fiction, and that makes it both realistic, fictional, and exciting. So, thanks for joining us today, and it's been really good to talk to you. So thank you, and we'll end this webinar now.
Pleasure to catch up. Thank you.